Welcome to another episode of Samso Insights, where we get thoughts from people from the industry, and get them to sort of share their thoughts. We're here at the University Club here in Crawley, on the campus of the University of Western Australia. So we're here today with Tony Goode. We're going to be sort of talking about mining and politics, implications, state and federal, and international point of view. So, Tony, welcome to Samso Insights. You are from the sort of political arena and plus the business world. Your history is that you work in the backrooms of that political arena. Tony, maybe just give us a good sort of introduction to yourself and what you do, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Noel. And I must say it's a pleasure to be here on this beautiful rainy day. And I say that because my original upbringing was in the country regions of Western Australia, so rain is always welcome. Look, a little bit about myself. I've been around for quite a while, as you can tell from the absence of hair, but originally I started off working in the public sector, Treasury, and more specifically the Australian Taxation Office. And I spent some years in Canberra at a time of dramatic change in the structure of the public sector. And then I moved into private enterprise, where I've worked for small and large companies, and I've also had a rural business. But in the last 10 to 15 years, predominantly speaking, I've been a business consultant with a particular focus on mining and putting mining projects together. In terms of politics, let me tell you, I've been a member of the Liberal Party for a long time, and I don't want anybody in the audience here to hold that against me. So that's a little bit of a background about myself, Noel. So with that, I'd like to handball back to you.
Look, Tony, we've known each other for a fair while, and we've had a lot of sort of
It feels like
discussion.
about 40 years, Noel, but yeah. It's actually only about 4 or 5, but anyway.
Look, the topic that we've had over the past, and I thought it's good for us to share with the Samso platform.
Yeah.
Like ESG in mining and politics. How do you view that? With your sort of dealings with that level, and also understanding what mining is and the requirements for ESG compliance. How do you see that sitting in that space at the moment?
Look, rather than burrow right down into the ESG side of things, I think that it's worthwhile commenting on the macro factors and in what's happening with an incoming Labor government. And here in West Australia, the situation where we've got both a dominant Labor government in state level, and as I said, the incoming Labor government. So it's the macro settings which I think will determine how that filters through the mining sector, and particularly the ESG components. And in reviewing and reflecting on that, we are at a very pivotal period as far as Australia's future is concerned, particularly with regards to the economy and the challenges which we currently face. And I will just perhaps rehash a couple of those macro factors for those that aren't too sure, but I mean, you're getting a lot of press about them. And one of the headline numbers, of course, is inflation. Now, the latest figures have come out, and we're running at about 6.1% inflation rate. And the projections are that we will peak at about an 8.3% inflation rate. Now, of course, we haven't experienced that for more than 30 years. So this is going to be very, very challenging. The Reserve Bank was a little bit tardy in responding and didn't quite get its forecast right, and so it was out by a year or two in terms of when it thought that the inflationary pressures would be such that they would need to use the large club of monetary policy to try and address that. But they're doing so, and so we've seen the rate lifted significantly over the last 6 months, and that's expected to continue to rise. And the United States, naturally enough, sets a lot of the parameters for the rest of the developed countries, including Australia. Now, the bad news overnight was that the US has slipped into a technical recession. So that's not a great lead from them. The the other issues in Australia at the moment for the incoming government is that there's a lot of pressures and built up demand on wages. So there hasn't been any real wages growth over the last decade. Now, a Labor government, naturally enough, has strong allegiances to the union movement. And so the pressure on growth of wages is very significant, and a Labor government is going to have to very carefully manage that in a way that keeps their unions on side. I listened to the Treasurer last night, and what he's said is almost a hope for or wish that the unions will be gentle for a year or two, and then they will work in with the government to manage a lift in wages. Now, when you do that, the key thing that comes to mind is productivity. And there hasn't been a great national conversation around productivity for a long time. But now we're virtually forced into really having productivity front and centre. If you're going to support a growth in real wages, then you need to see a lift in productivity. And so the challenge there is, how do you achieve that? And that's where the policies from government will need to be carefully implemented, and we'll need to sort through what the practical ramifications are all the way through to industry, including mining. So if I go back to that term productivity and the implications, in order to improve productivity, there are things that we will need to do nationally which will about broadening the base of the economy. So we need to have greater diversity, and we need greater complexity. Now, doing that is, of course, not simple, but the incoming government will have some policies. The outgoing government also had some significant policies. I have to be fair-minded here and let me say that I think that the coalition government was slow to respond to that challenge. So what we should have done is diversified earlier, and we've been talking about it a lot, but we haven't been acting on it. Now, the coalition government did have a manufacturing plan, a plan to invest, I think, 1.2 billion into broadening the manufacturing base. Now, that program is going to be in the sights of the Labor government. And one of the reasons that it will be in the sights of the Labor government is that whilst they'll be implementing their own programs, and there's nothing particularly new, they were outlined at in the election, they will be desperately seeking to trim the budget fat, because we're also faced with a massive, and I'd say it's a massive national debt. And Noel, this is the first time that we've talked about the word $1 trillion, but the national debt is more or less around about $1 trillion. So that is a huge number. It's a huge headline number, and it has grown enormously over the last 3 years. Obviously, a large chunk of that is as a result of the implementation by the coalition as part of their COVID relief packages, the Job Seeker and Job Keeper programs. And let me say, again, in the interest of being fair-minded, those programs were supported by both Labor as well as implemented by the coalition. And I think that they were very good programs, and they certainly did tremendous work in ensuring that we didn't slip into a recession during that COVID time. So very good programs, but it means that the percentage of debt has gone up from 20% approximately to 60% of GDP. So $1 trillion out of a national GDP figure of more or less $1.8 trillion. So I wanted to just spend a bit of time on some of that macro stuff, Noel. It may not interest everybody, but I think it provides the overall context for how that trickles through and impacts the mining sector.
It's a good point, because I think it's a reality that is factual. I guess it's not longer we wish it wasn't there. So my thinking, Now, the thoughts of the, because ESG is effectively something that's growing in need, and it is to some degree, in my um, thoughts, is that it's always been around, but ESG's collated all these things and put into three letters, therefore it was one basket. It was sort of social, environmental, you're going to get all your impact studies done anyway, but there was no one basket to put all them in, which we have now. That was a cost that was borne separately, so it's very hard for people to say it costs you X, Y, Z. And my thinking now is that the biggest issue now is obviously the wages part, and this inflationary pressures that we are seeing, which you've just described. Do you think that the policies and coming from government, and as well the need for the ESG compliance, will actually add to that issue, or do you think it's just already disseminated into everyday costs?
Noel, that is a tricky question, but I'll answer it this way, bluntly saying that in the short term, yes, it will come as a cost. There's no doubt about that. Businesses have become accustomed to dealing with, over the last 20 to 30 years, additional costs imposed by complying with various legislation and regulatory environments that are imposed upon them. It's not always been easy. The large businesses been in a better position to be able to deal with that, obviously. My fear is more for the small to medium business sector, who are meant to very rapidly develop the expertise to be able to deal with the regulatory environment that they are faced with. Large businesses seem to take it in their stride, but there will be an additional cost. Now that, I emphasise, I see that as an impact in the relatively short term. What they really will be needing to deal with is the longer term implications of restructuring provided by or in response to climate change and technology that has been implemented as a consequence, particularly with respect to energy and energy generation. Here in Western Australia, we feel pretty insulated because we had the gas reservation policy in place, which the eastern states did not have, and so consequently you saw a very rapid increase in the energy prices on the eastern seaboard, following on from the Russia-Ukrainian war. Now, they are trying to, the Labor government is trying to address that through policies that are dealt with via EMO, who can intervene in the marketplace to force the energy providers to ratchet up supply or adjust the pricing mechanisms. Now, the technology side of things, of course, is that we're seeing massive change in how we produce electricity. And so you're seeing a huge uptake in the solar and wind power, and over time we're also seeing that augmented by large-scale battery technology. And that's only going to increase. So what that will mean is that down the track, and I'm talking some ways down the track, and not too many people are really thinking about this, there's a focus on the cost of energy, of electricity at the moment, but over time, I think we will end up with very low cost electricity. Now, the cost uptick in the short to medium term will definitely be there during that transition period, but we'll get to a point in time where the technological advances are such that the clean energy sector delivers very, very, very cheap electricity. And in addition, the technology changes with battery will mean that we'll be able to use the clean energy surpluses will be readily stored and put back into the grid. So I think that that is going to wreak really substantial change for everybody, ordinary consumers, for companies, for businesses. We'll get to a stage where we will have clean, reliable, cheap electricity, and that'll be fantastic. In other sectors relating to climate change and our requirements to reduce emissions, will be very, very large scale. Of course, I'm thinking here of transport. Now, I looked at the figures for the uptake in electric vehicles in the United States, and I think to the 30th of June 2021, from a very low base in the US, there was a quadrupling of the electrical vehicles going on their roads. Australia is even further behind the 8 ball there, but at a tiny base, but that is also going to be lifted, and the incoming Labor government, policy-wise, has got a policy of providing inducements to convert your petrol vehicle to battery. Now, what does that mean in the mining sector? Well, if I may segue, it's a big segue, Noel, but just humour me for this. It is about the battery minerals. It's about the battery minerals, and that's where I get really excited. You probably know this, but there are approximately 14 potential battery minerals, including the rare earths. The big ones are being lithium, nickel, copper. Now, 14 elements are required. There's only one place on the planet that has all 14, and that is called Western Australia. Western Australia has access to all 14 minerals. It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary opportunity. I'll segue back to an earlier segue and talk about clean energy. Western Australia is fantastically placed to provide blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. And by that we mean hydrogen that is produced ultimately via clean energy.
Cleaner energy.
Cleaner energy. Now, the cleanest one, which is your green hydrogen, which will be used, will be generated by using solar and wind and battery input to split water and produce the hydrogen. So WA is placed just uniquely, both for the critical minerals and for clean the energy and hydrogen. So that's massive opportunities for us. Look, I've been speaking a lot about the macro factors, but it does percolate all the way through to very practical things. And where Noel is coming from is, does it create a bigger challenge for industry? And does the change of government make that so, or make it worse, or make it better? And we'll talk about a few things here, but I was earlier on, I was quite excited to be talking about the potential here in Western Australia, particularly in relation to all the minerals that apply to producing cleaner energy. What that brings me back to is frankly a failure of government, and the failure of government at both state and federal level, because it's about state and federal relationships, is about power sharing. And Noel, it saddens me, but as someone that's obviously a keen observer of politics and a participant, it saddens me that old chestnut, the relationship between states and the federal government, remains, and it is focused on a failure of power sharing. In other words, the collaboration between states and the federal government to fairly and reasonably share their powers in a way that makes it easier for business to be businesses. That's it. And I'll give you a really big example of this, a really huge example of this. And what springs to mind is Gina Reinhardt's Hancock Mining, bringing her very large-scale iron ore project, bringing that home so that it is producing, and it's producing now. She notoriously said, I think it was about 2 years ago, she said that it had taken more than five, excuse me for that retraction there, that she had to deliver over 1,000 documents or reports or plans to comply. Her compliance cost was based on producing over 1,000 documents. I mean, that's crazy stuff. Now, I earlier mentioned about power sharing. That is an outcome of a failure to adequately power share. So what does that mean? It means multiple environmental reports produced for the state of Western Australia, multiple environmental reports produced for the federal government, multiple compliance on just a broad array of things that are required as the precursor to bring a project to fruition. I think that's quite outrageous. It is done better in many other places in the world. It's done worse, but we could do so much better. And so the pettiness that comes through in the dealings between states and the federal government is something that we really need to acknowledge, talk about, and then force governments to get down and try and resolve. Right? Yes, it's easier if, for example, you have more coalition governments in play, or you have a group of like-minded Labor governments in play. That's true. But even when we've had those circumstances, neither political party has adequately addressed them. It's not a sexy issue. When you talk about federal-state relationships to the average voter, and they'll fall asleep. No. But you and I, involved in mining, know that that has heavy implications. Big costs, but more importantly, you are seeing really good projects not getting off the ground because of that compliance issue. I think that is a pretty good response to your question. Hopefully it's touching on those things.
So Tony, stepping from what you've just described in terms of the bureaucracy and the issues that come with it, how do you think it will affect, let's say, an investor looking at companies, let's say in the iron ore industry or oil and gas industry, against the green movement and critical metals, which is the talk of the town now? How do you help the investors digest this kind of talk from government?
Oh, look, it is an interesting question, Noel. There's no doubt about that. If you look at the economy as a whole, there's 4 sectors that drive the Australian economy and commodities. So it's iron ore, gas, coal, and education. Those are the 4 biggest sectors that they're the engine of our economy. That's the reality. Now, we know that we know that coal is on the way out, but nonetheless, it's still a huge export for us. What we're seeing, and dovetailing with the climate change action, and we're seeing with the incoming government a stronger focus on its green credentials, and it's lifting the emissions target and it's seeking to have them legislated. So what it means is clearly it's messaging about winding back coal, but they will remain very much on board with gas. And gas is seen as the transition energy, going from coal to green energy. The Ukrainian-Russian war has highlighted some issues, supply issues on that front. The big uptick in the East Coast pricing for electricity has also rammed home the need for any government to manage that transition in a way that doesn't massively upset the voters / consumers. So government will react appropriately, I think, regardless of its natural inclination as a Labor government to be unduly focused, if I can use that term, on the green energy sector. Iron ore. Now, iron ore will remain. That'll be the one constant. So the federal government will be keen to remain relatively supportive. But it doesn't get away from the fact, as I've touched on earlier, that the failure of all governments to deal with that federal-state power sharing arrangements means that smaller scale projects will always be fraught with a lot of risk and a lot of cost in order to get off the ground. Okay, that's just the blunt message that I think we all have to accept. It's not going to improve. But nonetheless, governments recognise that as a major, massive export earner, they need to provide some level of support. That level of support will really be less on the bureaucracy, which I fear is not going to improve, but it'll be more about continuing the infrastructure spending to facilitate the uptick in the projects. And that side is a little bit more promising, if I can put it that way.
Okay. So, adding that to the next question, when a state politician or a federal politician speak on policies related to the mining industry or air policy that affects investors out there, whether it be pharmaceutical or things like that, in your opinion, in your experience, how much influence do they have when they speak? Who should investors be listening more to?
Look, you have to forgive me if I laugh. It's when you've been relatively close to these things, you see lots of the old Yes Minister material re-emerging. Yes Minister, for those that don't know, was a very funny British show which highlighted the relationship between the public sector and government. First broadcast in the late 1970s, I think. Anyway,
You don't believe any of them?
I was pausing to think, well, how upfront should I be? How blunt should I be? It's partially the case that the bureaucracy will get behind the flavour of what the government minister is saying, partially, and partially the fact that the bureaucracy would remain with an entrenched view and agenda and will passively aggressively work against it. And I think you see that quite starkly at times where a government minister goes off message with respect to very clear-cut Treasury advice / guidelines, and it creates some tensions. But at the end of the day, trying to put that level of cynicism aside, if I may, or park it to some extent, the bureaucrats realise, or they do know that ultimately that the ministers hold the power and that they need to be seen to be doing the right thing to further the agenda of the government of the day.
Okay. Look, I guess, that's sort of in line with my cynical view about politicians, is that it's like the changing direction of the wind when they speak. So, look, and I guess the other side of that is that when we talk about, because there's a change in geopolitical within the world, right? And obviously that's already given some sort of uplift to critical metals that were sort of really very China dominated, Russian dominated, mainly China dominated. And I'm speaking of rare earths and obviously things that like tin has some issues, and so there is a big push in WA, in Australia, to chase these kind of minerals. Well, do you think that national interests will override, let's just say, like the Green Movement or something, or will there be carry favours of nationalism from a government if you're chasing, rare earths or something? But I'm not putting words in. I'm just saying, could you see that happening?
I think it's fair to say that regardless of political persuasion, in Australia there is a strong recognition of the significance of the critical minerals. The very fact that there's a critical minerals policy and that there are measures in place to promote the search for and the exploration and the mining of those minerals is essentially a bipartisan environment. So I don't think it's going to change. I think it's going to continue to improve with policies that have largely been put in place by the coalition government. But at a global level, you're seeing that those policies are also generally in harmony with the biggest players such as the United States, particularly with respect to a pushback against the Chinese dominance. Once again, and as I've touched on earlier, Western Australia has rare earths, particularly in the area around Meekatharra and other areas. And outside of Chinese producers, Australia has Lynas Corporation, which is doing really well and is actually mining and refining rare earths. We'll continue to do that. It is strategically significant. The United States fully recognises that. The United States itself really only has one current mine that can be geared up to produce rare earths themselves. So they support all the efforts that we in Australia are doing. And I think globally too, it's not just US push back against Chinese dominance in certain mineral sectors. It is the rest of the world are also recognise that and are making their own efforts to diversify away from Chinese supply. So that's a good thing. So it's created a pretty good bipartisan environment, to be honest and fair-minded, Noel.
Yeah, I think from a mining perspective, whether it's the right thing to say or not, but the changing geopolitical sort of boundary is actually a good thing for the mining industry. It's really created a lot of new markets, new hope, I guess.
I endorse what you're saying, Noel, and to sort of shine a light on one of those subsectors that I think will grow strongly and vigorously is the vanadium mining situation. We have, of course, vanadium in Western Australia, and there are players there. AVL springs to mind, for instance, that are gearing up to produce it. And I think that the vanadium redox battery technology, I think, will come into its own. It's gradually emerging, and I think that will become a significant player, particularly for static battery storage. It has big advantages over lithium-ion-based batteries. It's ideal for operating in harsh environments with high temperatures, and it has a colossal capacity to recharge and to be brought on stream in a nanosecond. So I think that's going to become a really important player for us, and I'm very optimistic about that.
Tony, I think it's a great conversation. I guess I'm trying to give viewers out there a take from your sector, how they should read some of these, going from inflationary issues to policy issues, bureaucracies, how that sort of adds into the complicating world of investment, right? How good should I buy this stock? And sure enough, first off has to be technicals, but the other bit that I always talk about, which is the deliverance of the product, I think this is where everything fits in, right? As you pointed out, if Gina Reinhardt's having issues getting compliance to happen, a smallish company with that kind of same commodity or product, location, etc., probably would suffer in that sense. Look, any last words, Tony, to surmise what you've said?
Oh, two words spring to mind. One is facing up to key challenges. They are there. They are very significant. We've talked about inflation as an issue. We've talked about the need to refocus on productivity. So there's a couple of big challenges. We're talking about the challenge of converting to greener energy and climate change. Big challenges. But for each and every single big challenge, there's also a massive opportunity. It's a massive opportunity, Noel. And I'm not here to tell you and to focus on the impact of changes in the political environment, because I don't think they are that sharp that they would unduly and adversely affect our way forward. That's not the message that I'd be giving you. My message is about, let's face those challenges and let's seize on those opportunities, which are plentiful. Plentiful. Western Australia is about the best place to be. If you're interested in conducting business and doing mining, you come to WA. It is the land of opportunity. It is the Los Angeles of the Southern Hemisphere. This is what I actually genuinely 100% believe. Thanks, Noel.
All right, Tony, thank you. And we can talk another time.
Thank you, Noel. Oh, Noel, if I may just finish, and I know you want to become more commercial because you're a man that knows the value of the dollar. I'd like to say that today's episode, I was going to say, has been brought to you by Aman. Aman is my barber and he has a big job to do on my luscious locks. Aman operates out of Midland, Centre Point, terrific hairdresser, great haircut, great value.